ink was dry for 700 years before anyone saw it again. It sat in a mislabeled box in the Vatican archive. Roman dust covered the surface. 3 cardinal seals, cracked but legible. A date, August 1308. And an absolution, formal, specific, reconciling 5 men with the church and lifting the heresy charges that had been brought against them. One of those men was Jacques de Molay. He had led the Knights Templar for 22 years. 6 years after this document was signed and sealed, he was rowed to an island in the Seine and tied to a stake. He burned anyway. The absolution had been granted by the highest ecclesiastical authority in the Christian world. It changed nothing. Not the sentence, not the fire, not the 7 centuries of silence that followed. This is the story of how a man died for charges that had already been privately lifted at the highest level of the church, and of the document that records it. That document still exists. A scholar published it in a peer-reviewed journal in 2004. The Vatican released a facsimile in 2007. Almost no one noticed. The question it should have answered 7 centuries ago remains open. What did the King of France hold over the Pope that was enough to make him let absolved men burn? To answer that, you have to understand what the Templars were, and what made them dangerous to the wrong king. Tallow pools in an iron dish beneath a vaulted ceiling. A wooden chest opens for the last time. The air smells of ink and animal skin. By the late 13th century, the Templars were the largest independent financial institution in Europe. Their Paris headquarters functioned as the French royal treasury. Kings deposited revenue with them. Popes granted them immunity from secular courts. They answered to no king, no duke, no archbishop, only to the Pope himself. Their banking network stretched from London to Jerusalem, and the French crown owed them money it could not repay. That debt is where the story begins, not with heresy, with money. Philip IV of France was bankrupt. Decades of war, failed currency manipulations, and his largest creditor was an institution he could not tax, could not sue, could not seize, and could not touch through any legal mechanism available to a secular king. So he found the one mechanism that was not secular. He needed heresy. Philip identified the one jurisdiction that could override Templar immunity, the Church. Then he identified the one category of crime the Church could not afford to ignore: heresy. Then he manufactured the evidence. He did not do this impulsively. He did it the way an engineer builds a machine. He found the weakness in the system, designed a tool to exploit it, and assembled the parts before anyone understood what the machine was for. The charges were built from a single expelled Templar whose grievances Philip's agents had cultivated for months: blasphemy, ritual denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, sodomy. The charges were chosen not because they were true. They were chosen because they could not be defended against in public. A pope who stood up for men accused of desecrating the cross would destroy himself faster than the accused. Philip understood the church's own machinery better than the church did, and he turned it into a weapon. Philip did not ask for cooperation. He built a situation where refusal was suicide. The church's own doctrine became the instrument of its complicity. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, before dawn, royal agents broke down the doors of every Templar commandery in France. Simultaneously, hundreds of locations, thousands of arrests. Not a single warning had leaked. Sealed orders, distributed in advance, opened at the same hour across the kingdom. The Templars were taken in their beds. Philip's agents inventoried everything: banking records, property deeds, grain stores, horses, correspondence. They found almost everything. Almost. The liquid treasury was gone. Not in the commanderies, not in Paris. Its last confirmed location was several weeks before the arrests. It never appeared in any French royal inventory again. Someone had moved the wealth of the richest private institution in Europe before the king's men arrived. The Templar leadership claimed they had no warning. If that was true, someone else did. Where that wealth went and who moved it remains unanswered. But the men who might have known were now in Philip's cells. Straw on the floor of an empty stable. A bridle hangs from a hook where a horse stood yesterday. Somewhere outside, a dog barks at a gate that will not open. The confessions came quickly. They always do under those conditions. The inquisitors were royal appointees. They answered to Philip, not to Rome. The statements they extracted had a strange uniformity. The same crimes, confessed in the same order, using the same phrasing, in commanderies hundreds of miles apart. That reads not as corroboration. It reads as a script. Philip sent the confessions to Rome. He had his documentary record, but the record did not hold. When the Templar leadership appeared before a papal commission in Paris, a different proceeding under papal authority, de Molay stood and retracted his confession. So did the others. They described how the statements had been extracted. They described the methods used on their bodies. They insisted, under oath, that every charge was fabricated. The evidentiary foundation of the French case collapsed. In public, on the record, before papal witnesses. The case should have died here. It did not. And here the story turns. Because Clement V did something a weak pope would never have done. He convened a private hearing. In August 1308, at the castle of Chinon, 3 cardinal legates sat across from 5 senior Templar leaders, Jacques de Molay among them. The doors were closed. A notary recorded the proceedings. One by one, the Templar leadership retracted the confessions again. They described the methods. They described the instruments. They described what had been done to the men who broke before them. The legates weighed the testimony. They consulted canon law on absolution following coerced confession, and they absolved them, all 5, formally, in writing, with seals. The Chinon parchment records that proceeding. The Latin is precise. The absolution clause is specific. 3 cardinal seals at the bottom. The date, August 17th, 1308. The document was now real. It was signed. It was sealed. It carried the full weight of canon law. And there was no court left that would hear it. Clement filed it. He did not destroy it. That matters. He did not publish it. That matters more. It was placed in a register box with the wrong reference number, in a section of the archive that had nothing to do with the Templars. While the document sat in its folder, the men it absolved sat in their cells for 6 more years. The truth was already written. The seal was already pressed. And every day that passed made the silence harder to justify. The folder went into the dark. The dark lasted 700 years. Wax hardens around a cord pressed through parchment. The impression holds long after the hand that set it has gone to bone. Dust settles on a shelf where nothing will be disturbed for 7 centuries. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, Clement formally dissolved the Templars. He did not convict them of heresy. He used an administrative procedure called proviso, not a judicial condemnation. The distinction was deliberate. It was the kind of distinction only a trained canon lawyer would make. Clement was a trained canon lawyer. The order would cease to exist, but its members would not be declared heretics. The Templar leaders were handed to French secular courts for sentencing. The document that could have changed everything was already in the archive, filed under the wrong number, gathering dust. The men it covered were handed to the courts of the king who had fabricated the charges in the first place. To understand why Clement never used it, you have to understand the cage Philip built around him. The first instrument was the Boniface threat. In 1303, Philip had engineered the arrest of Clement's predecessor, Pope Boniface VIII. Boniface died within a month. Now, Philip held a weapon worse than accusation. He held a possibility. He could reopen the case, try Boniface for heresy after death. If that trial succeeded, every papal act from Boniface's reign could be retroactively voided. Every appointment, every dispensation, including the chain of events that led to Clement's own election. Philip did not need to file the charges. He only needed Clement to know he could. First lock. The second instrument was geography. Clement lived inside the reach of the man he might have needed to accuse. The walls of Avignon were thick, but they were French walls on French soil. Clement had become pope with Philip's support. The French cardinals who elected him understood the terms. He governed the church from inside the borders of the king who controlled whether he survived. Second lock. The third instrument was the simplest. The papacy had no army. France did. That was the last lock. The cage was complete. Each instrument alone was survivable. Together, they were a cage with no door. Clement had the truth. He had it in writing. He had it signed and sealed. He possessed enough legitimacy to expose the entire prosecution as fabrication. What he did not have was enough power to survive telling it. That is the shape of his tragedy. Not cowardice, not indifference. A man who held the truth and lacked the force to make it matter. He could have destroyed the document. He didn't. Whether that was conscience or calculation, the parchment does not say. It records the absolution. It does not record why the absolution was never used. But the fact that it survived tells us something. Clement did not erase the truth. He buried it. And he buried it in a place where, if anyone ever looked, they would find it. No one looked for 700 years. There is one more question the parchment cannot answer. The Templar treasury vanished before the arrests. Philip seized everything else, but the liquid wealth was gone. The papal records say nothing. Whether Clement knew where it went, whether that knowledge was leverage he chose never to use, has never been resolved. The treasury's disappearance deepens the suspicion around Clement's silence. but it does not explain it. What explains it is that the institution chose to survive. Not the men, not the truth, the institution. And the document that could have saved the men became instead the evidence of how the institution saved itself. The river moves beneath a gray sky. Smoke rises from somewhere the eye refuses to settle. On the bank, a crowd watches something it will not be able to explain. On March 18, 1314, de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay were rowed to the Ile de Javelot, a narrow island in the Seine, visible from both banks. They had been sentenced to life imprisonment, not death. But that afternoon, before the assembled crowd, both men recanted their confessions for the final time. They declared the charges false. They declared the order faithful. Philip ordered them burned the same afternoon. No further trial, no ecclesiastical proceeding, no papal consultation. The same day. The stakes were already prepared. The wood was already stacked. Philip had been waiting for exactly this moment. The public recantation was the pretext he needed to escalate from imprisonment to execution. De Molay's final act of defiance was the last thing Philip required to finish what he started 7 years earlier. Somewhere in the Vatican archive, the document that absolved these men was still in its folder, still sealed, still unread. The truth was written down. It did not help. From the stake, de Molay cursed the king and the pope by name. He summoned them both before God within the year. Multiple contemporary chronicles record this. Clement V was dead within 32 days. Philip IV was dead before the year was out. The parchment remained. In 2001, a historian named Barbara Frall pulled a register box from a shelf in the Vatican Apostolic Archive. She was researching the Templar trials, a subject she had studied for years. The box was numbered. The number did not match the Templar proceedings. She opened it anyway. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder was a parchment. 3 cardinal seals. August 1308. The absolution clause was unmistakable. 700 years after the fire, the evidence came back. A seal under electric light looks nothing like a seal under candlelight. The silence of an archive is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room where everything has been said and no one came to listen. Frall published her findings in Archivum Historiae Pontificia in 2004. The paper was peer-reviewed. The evidence was unambiguous. In 2007, the Vatican released a facsimile edition, a limited-run volume, available to scholars. No press conference, no institutional statement, no revision of the standard historical account. In a murder case, the return of suppressed evidence reopens the verdict. Here, the evidence returned. The verdict did not change. The world received the Chinon parchment the same way the archive had held it, in silence. The misfiling itself remains unresolved. Fraile believes it was accidental, a clerk's error compounded by centuries of no one looking. Others have questioned whether a document of this significance could end up in the wrong section by chance. The archive was maintained by professionals, but archives are large, imperfect, and operated by humans. Whether the concealment was deliberate or accidental, the effect was the same: 700 years of invisibility. And when that invisibility finally ended, the silence did not. It simply became modern. The Avignon papacy lasted another 60 years after Clement's death. 60 years of decisions made under similar pressures, filed in similar archives, subject to similar accidents of preservation and loss. The treasury has never been found. The standard account has not been revised. The official history still reads the way it read before Fraile opened that box. The Chinon parchment is available, published, authenticated. It records the moment a pope's own legates examined the evidence, heard the testimony, and granted absolution. It changes the meaning of everything that followed its signing. And it saved no one. The date reads August 17th, 1308. 3 seals, clear Latin, 6 years before the fire. The document was in the archive the entire time. The truth survived. The institution survived. The men did not.